Hello, my name is Bettina. I'm the director of the SETI Institute's Artist-in-Residence program. Today's guest is the trailblazing artist, DJ, and producer Daedelus, who is one of our artists in residence. We'll be talking about their recently released album, Xenopocene, which imagines the first 10,000 days after first contact with an alien civilization. We'll chat about their creative process, what inspired them during their 2-year residency with the AIR program, and we get to hear excerpts from this fascinating album. But before I introduce our guest, I'd like to welcome our viewers who are joining us from all around the world on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. Please tell us in the comments where you're joining us from. And if you have questions about anything that we're talking about, please put those in the comments and we will get to those at the end of our chat. So let me introduce our guest. Daedalus has released over 20 LPs and countless EPs and remixes. As a performer, Daedalus has played over 1,000 live shows on 6 continents at venues ranging from underground events like the seminal Low End Theory to festival main stages such as Coachella. They are currently assistant professor for the Berklee Music of a College of Music in Boston as a founding faculty member of the new Electronic Digital Instrument program. Daedalus has been at the forefront of many performance techniques, from working with early prototypical monome controllers to cutting-edge modular systems, as well as AV shows that are robotic, volumetric, and interactive. Welcome, Daedalus.
Thank you so much, Bettina, and I really do appreciate that very generous bit of intro, but I will say one of my highlights now on my resume is certainly being a SETI Air, 100%. It was inspirational. It resulted in more than just a record. It really changed some of my facing on both education and the outreach that we have, the mission of scientists and artists to collate, and create something from what is usually a mess of data that maybe is a little bit impersonal, and then equally something that could be very personal but not necessarily speaking to greater truths. So I feel elevated and motivated to make more out of this.
I mean, that is fantastic because we have our residency for about 2 years, but of course you are part of the family now, and ideally a residency is a springboard to further work for the rest of your creative career. Yeah. And speaking of springboards, this is our second SETI Live together. So when you first entered the AIR program, we had a chat about what kind of music you create and what your plans were for your time in the program. Mm-hmm. And at that moment, you were interested in creating a listening experience that would immerse the listener in the SETI Institute's iconic search for techno signals and would act as a metaphor for the research taking place at the Allen Telescope Array. But your concept has kind of focused in more on a different narrative, and I find it a lot more interesting. So you want to talk about the Xenopocene project? What does the title even mean?
Yeah, so Xenopocene points at a kind of a current emerging consensus among scientists and thought leaders about an Anthropocene, that we live in an age that's so touched by humanity that it's undeniable that we've etched ourselves into the earth. I have a belief, especially after talking to SETI scientists, as well as looking at some of the data, that upon the kind of realization of the alien or other, we would enter a Xenopocene, an alien age, that would equally have such a profound effect on our concept of our ecology and our humanity, as well as just our physical environs, that would ultimately force us to be otherwise, to kind of, even in the short span that we've had Anthropocene, to move to other. And and actually in the background you may hear my small child, which also in this past 2.5 years, almost the same span that I've been a SETI Air, I've had a child, and that also forced me to think about what it is that we're doing here, right? So these kind of profound thoughts, I think, occur to many. I've just happened to have a little bit of data and science in my back pocket after being an Air to kind of help found and foment what may well be, as soon as we receive that call, as soon as we get that proven techno signal that is actually of intelligence that we can kind of depack, right? It may indeed unmoor us. And so we have this opportunity now to kind of ideate and realize a little bit of what that might be. Sonically is kind of my best language. That's the art that I choose, even though I think it could be done elsewise. And I just am grateful that a record could emerge that has some sense, because there is a lot of nonsense in the mix of things. That's one of the things I learned also in the SETI science. There's a lot of noise out there, so to speak, even though there isn't that much sound, but there's a lot of noise that we have to parse through. And so what is it like to then make something that really is reactive to that thought, that big grand thought of what happens next, in the profound sense?
That's right. I mean, I think it is really unique for somebody to approach that first contact scenario and think about what happens in the next 10,000 days, and sort of create a musical narrative based on that. So why did you choose 10,000 days?
So 10,000 days is pointing at both like something a little amongst 27 years, a little bit more than 27 years, which to me is this kind of, at least in the musical sense, is this often we, in generational movement, have these kind of resurgences and kind of looking back fondly at things. And it gave me the opportunity to quote some of my own history, because I happen to have enough years to kind of think in these spans. But also 10,000 days points at these kind of powers of 10, this Charles and Ray Eames function of like, if we have a day zero, if we have first contact, if we have all these things that tend to get bandied about in science fiction narratives, like, well, day one needs to be just as important. And then day 10, obviously we're still in the slipstream, day 100, day 1000, day 10,000. And then eventually we have to really start thinking about outside and other, not just from a terrestrial point of view, but from that 6,000 years it would take to get to the nearest exoplanet. 6,000 plus. 6,000 might be, that's using at the very limit of conventional spacecraft travel. So not to dream too much up and out, like that's just the last song on the record. The vast majority is very concerned with humanity, and it's in the direct notion of what happens day zero and on. And since releasing the record, we've gone through day one, we've gone through day 10. We're at these like little moments, and I have to kind of imagine, well, what if the record releasing was that burst, that signal, that notification, so to speak, on our phones that told us that something indeed was else. And yeah, it just forced me to think, well, like it seems rather banal actually right now, like day 10 post record release doesn't seem that unusual for me. Maybe it's the some odd records that I've released that have put me in that position, but I think something would be vastly different if we had like real definitive proof of alien intelligence. The other thing too I like about this period of days is that there is some musical resemblance to it. There is something to be said for what happens when you have this first quote of a sound narrative, of a leitmotif, as some operatic people might be inclined to so put. And so then when you reiterate and you kind of play around with those notions across a span, it gives some place by which to do so, some place by which to make an artistic quote.
I love this idea of scale, because this is something when you are engaging with astronomy and with SETI, that we move beyond human comprehension of scale. I can imagine 10 days. I can't really I can imagine 100 days. That's pretty easy. Once you get to 1,000 or like 10,000 days, thank you for pointing out it was 27 years. I had not done the math in my head that quickly. But then, between that and like the 6,000 plus years, we would need to go somewhere else. But now we're talking generational, and it's very interesting that you're sort of scaling up and you're thinking in those terms. It's very much a SETI way of thinking, and it seems that like you've really absorbed the SETI Institute in your creative process, at least in that respect.
Well, and I will offer that you mentioned earlier that I have these other kind of notions about artistic ideals that came out of just initially talking with SETI Air, other people in the AIR program, as well as some SETI scientists. And I was full of all these ideas, and a lot of it had to do with this instantaneous transmission of like, you get the data and you sonify it or you kind of react to it. And that's well and good, but it's very likely, of course, that if we ever received a transmission, it would have come from across so many light years distance, so many star systems away or such, that the scale and the order of magnitude, that the time that it would take for such things to get to us is so unimaginable, so unfathomable, that it is very likely that anything we do receive is from a civilization that might be well and gone, if we already even think about it in the period of time that our own time scale. So what does that mean? Well, it means that so much of what we're doing here is we're pointing back at our own humanity. We're really listening in rather than listening up and out. Even if, obviously the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is so profound and so encouraging and so affirming of our own humanity, but goodness, it really also points this mirror at ourselves in this act about the kind of futility of our own transmissions up and out, our own kind of exaltations.
Yeah. So it's a little bit noisy at my end. I hope you can't hear what you have. You have a babbling child. I have a barking dog. Apologies for the soundscape that we had not planned for the SETI Live. I will take this moment to welcome people to the space. Hello from to Chicago, Delaware, California, Miami, Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Netherlands, Toronto, Croatia, hello Croatia, Australia, the other end of the world for where I am. And we've got people from Norway, and I'm scrolling. This is, it's always wonderful that the whole world is joining these SETI Lives. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Okay, my dog has died down, so I'm ready to ask the next question. So I really love this review on the album, a review from your album. Wrote that you are attempting to parse out science-informed fiction from the fact that in an unfathomable universe, life exists outside our confines. So you talked a bit about how SETI science informed your composition. Like, are there any specific scientists that you work with who are, really gave you that creative boost?
Yeah, I mean, it was both a creative boost and also slightly that kind of shock of reality. Seth, I don't want to mess up the last name. You might have it better, Seth. Shostak. Yeah, is that how it is? Shostak? Seth Shostak? Was an incredible interview, was an incredible talk. In part because at that time, especially, I was like, well, what is making noise in the universe? What are we listening for? How are we listening? And he so clearly defined some of the techno signals that are actually receiving to us, and so little that's audio. So much of it is these other gravitational waves and these other phenomena that we can kind of look into as being, is this on a cosmic scale? Is this just the universe rattling around in its own mechanisms? Or is this something a lot more prescribed or described, and that they could be giving us hints at something else, right? I love this gravitational wave idea because some of my favorite frequencies are these really ultra low infrasound, kind of the low end that we kind of can hear and maybe a little bit below our audible hearing range, but are certainly affecting the upper order harmonics. I dig that kind of thing. And this idea of gravitational waves seems so fundamental, and the fact that somebody could, or something or some it could be playing around with is thrilling. And to know that we barely have the mechanisms to do that listening, it's like, well, we're at the beginning of all of this as a constant. SETI is an organization has been existing for, let's say, more than our 10,000 days, something on the order of, but not terribly much more on the cosmic scale, just a blip. And it's encouraging with someone like Seth, who was a little bit cringing at the kind of idea of sonification in the best way. It's because we don't want to be too fanciful. We want to keep it in the science. We want to keep things in the realm. Because there's already such an act of faith, is one of the things I was gathering from a few of the talks I had with scientists, is that there's ultimately this act of faith that knowing just the percentages and the probability there is something out there, but the idea that we would actually be in the capturing of that message or signal is such a sweet spot on a variety of levels, but not unlike the whole thing that our own planet has life, and that is such a sweet spot of space and time. So we have questions coming in that say, what genre of music are you doing? Will we have a chance to listen to it? Why don't we listen to some of your album? You have 11 tracks, right? There's 11 tracks, and some of them are more playing with the fundamentals of like day one, day zero, and kind of really speaking to it. There is one track that I would point out immediately, both because it is a bit sonorous. I don't have to explain ambient music to those of you out there. I think there's something about music generally is sound over time is an easy representation. Obviously, the act of our own listening is a little bit of sound over time, or a little bit of techno signals over time, is the kind of SETI mission too, in some ways. So I think what I'm going to dip into, if this is a good time to do so, I'll take myself off mic, and I'm going to play a song called A Considered Reply, which is subtitled Day One. And maybe this would be indicative of the rest of the record for some of y'all. I will say that there is this kind of underlying compositional idea that's repeating, refraining, whatever you want to say, and then reacting to it, replying to it in some ways is I worked with a violinist extensively on this record named Vivek Maman, and a super considerable talent. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to kind of bring him into the SETI web, so to speak. And it is the kind of thing where the violin is ultimately this kind of, I mean, I don't want to prescribe anything too much, but to me, it's like very indicative of the humanity listening up and kind of being a wiggly line amidst all this other kind of longer stretches. But maybe it could equally be alien. You all decide for yourselves.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
Now we know what to listen for.
Perfect. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That was so great. I mean, I've listened to the album before, but I love it every time, and I hear something different because there are so many layers of sound and mood that you can weave together.
Thank you.
And yes, the violin is kind of so often like a human voice, right?
Yeah, it has a warbly sonority and an imperfect perfection, if I may just dip in, might as well, that I really do appreciate. And to be quite frank, the record was coming together without the violin. There was a lot of things happening. I'm using a lot of granular synthesis throughout the record, which is just music speak for taking tiny grains of sound and dispersing them, displaying them, repositioning them throughout the kind of landscape to get all this kind of some of the moving effects, but some, I don't want to get too deep into that side of things. It's just really, it has this kind of weighty synthy thing going on. But then the violin just cresting across the top just transformed everything. It made me had to go back into the record and rethink much of what was occurring to try to recontextualize and then eventually discover a bit more of what was actually intended. This often happens with music where you have these intentions going into it and the sound itself has its own displayed idea, its own kind of predisposition, and you have to react.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is, I find in sort of so many art forms, there has been a comment in the comments about what's happening behind me. I'm besides directing the app program, I'm also a painter, and it's the same thing that you need to listen to your paintings because they're talking to you while you're painting them, and they want to go in a different direction where you had planned, and you just have to go like, okay, I'm just gonna follow where you lead. And I think in what you're saying is like in music, it's the same way. And I think that is this wonderful sort of recursive feedback loop between the artwork and the artist that keeps the creative process interesting, right?
Totally, yeah. And it's
Yeah.
so different than the science in some ways, where we have this predisposed theoretical idea that when it doesn't bear out, you pivot maybe in other ways, but maybe not so much where you're able to change what's happening underneath your feet. The data doesn't want to be so supple, perhaps, but I'm grateful that that indeed with the intention of that day one, for instance, it's so caught off guard. There's so much wonder to it. Some of the rest of the record does spend time, and I don't want to pivot too hard, but like I do reference things like Sun Ra's nuclear war a little bit, not so directly on its face. I'm not trying to sample nothing like that, but this idea that like that the future isn't all this kind of ease of utopia and ideals. There's a lot of science that kind of works all different kinds of ways. I find it interesting this Oppenheimer movies come out and things like that as well. Commentary, as well also with Gustav Holst's The Planets is another point of reference for myself. There's very few imaginings of the kind of spaceways, unlike Sun Ra. Holst and Sun Ra maybe don't come together too often, but I'm trying to hold them at least accountable together. And some of the imagining up that's happened in the music, historically speaking, towards outer spaces can't not be part of the inspiration of this. But yeah, indeed, like Holst has some cantankerous moments where maybe it's a little bit pulling from mythology, maybe more than the actual outer space, but some of that fractiousness, which is quite literally a song title, I tried to dip into as well. So hopefully people don't get the idea that this is just pretty on its face. There's some other things going on in the album as well. So.
Yeah, because you have 11 tracks and they feel to me like 11 chapters of a book. They, you know, when you listen to it, the mood changes, and so there's nearly like a narrative structure to it. Was that intended on your end?
I do love a good concept record, and so there's definitely some songs that are pointing more towards that, where they really are trying to take a, like I mentioned earlier, leitmotif, a little bit of fragment or phrase of melody, and kind of replay it in a slightly upwards, downwards, backward fashion, where the ear doesn't necessarily know immediately, but somewhere in the mix of the way we listen and the way we hear, if you were to imbibe it such the whole record as a continuous, that then maybe the narrative would pop up. Other songs do just play with the notion of things. There's the last track tends to be a little bit end credits, and then there's in the middle there's an intermission. Maybe that's a little bit more of a cinematic sway than it is directly a literary, but trying all kinds of things to be here, to be quite frank. This is still like, I can't state enough how elated I was to be a SETI heir, or to be a SETI heir in that kind of way, and have these kind of reactions, because you just don't get the chance to have such a meaty subject all the time. I do a lot in dance shapes. I love and adore dance floors and raves and renegade events, but you're only usually given just a tiny slice of what is usually an hour-long, 2-hour-long set. Can you really try to propose other? Narrative is definitely off the table. So I have records that kind of really go that direction, and they're very much in contrast to what I do live. And this record, I feel like, brings some of those same elements together. We've achieved this record live now once to a small degree, and I'm looking forward to more in that same way, that people might eat of it differently than those aforementioned parties.
So the album launched August 4th, and is available via Bandcamp, I understand. But there's also a physical thing that you are working on. That is vinyl. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, vinyl's a little silly, right? I mean, dinosaur bones transmitted into audio signals. It's great. I love it. I adore the physical form. So much of what I do enjoy a good sample, and I used to collect. I enjoy collecting music and kind of feeling of that place, going in time, transmitting myself. So I still want to make vinyl. I still want to do that thing. And colorful vinyl, especially, the kind of idea that the visual element of a record might really tell some of the tales. So I really was kind of trying to swing for the fences, if I may be allowed a sports metaphor, for this particular vinyl, of having colorful vinyl that then makes the the word Xenopocene, which is such an odd one, such an imagined phrase, really come alive in this individual way, so that every edition of the record that people might get their hands on will become alive with their own kind of wiggly, unique pressing of that vinyl. Something I love about colorful vinyl is that it's a chaotic process, much like the chaos that generated the telescope, the array that exists at the SETI HQ, so to speak, right? I kind of wanted to remind people of that as well in some small way. There's no accidents, right? It's all on purpose. And then equally, the kind of recursiveness that existed on something like, I don't want to echo the gold record too much. I think that's tread territory, even though I think it's very inspiring. With each record, there might be the opportunity for people to get a slip mat with a zoetrope on it, made by this person, Drew Tetz, who's an inventive, incredible creator, so that as this kind of slip mat spins and you look at it through a frame rate, such as like an iPhone or these kind of things, or any kind of camera, it'll create an animation actually in real time in front of you. So trying to catch all that wonder that I experience looking up and trying to transmit that in visual and audio forms as much as possible. So.
That is amazing. So I know that if you look in the chat, we have links to your album there. And I also like to take this opportunity, if you're going to sort of go toward websites, if you want to go to the SETI Institute's website, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that SETI is a non-profit organization, and it's due to contributions from viewers like you that SETI lives like this are possible. So if you go to SETI.org and hit donate, that would be amazing. Thank you all. And let me see, I'm looking at some comments. Here is a question. I have heard that some musicians who use the sound of the universe objects to create a new style and even a ton of sounds. So did you actually, from what I understand, like the sort of gist of this question, did you actually like sample sounds or did you fully create your own sounds?
So on this record, I reached for less of those buttons, even though I can totally understand the sonification of that data. The actual auditory universe is kind of slim. This narrow frequency band between 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz that we kind of exist in is just almost nothing. It's just, you get this clicking of quasars. Seth was quite nice to point out the clicking of quasars that he sometimes just tunes into, aims a radio telescope towards, and just gets this little kind of intermittent, sometimes very regular, sometimes very dispersed clicking sound. Fascinating, super interesting as a musician, this idea that there's tempo in space, awesome, but not not so much for I wasn't deriving tempo by looking at certain quasars, but that is a concept. That is definitely not a bad idea. And then also all these other kinds of ways of sonifying existing other audio that could be brought down to frequencies that we can perceive. Yeah, I mean, I want to say, though, what is more interesting to me is the reactions that people have had throughout time to outer space celestial events and the way that they've sonified that with the kind of limitations of just not knowing any better. And our not knowing any better is such a wonderful place that SETI exists, and we have lots of trying to point at, look at, listen to, and try to figure out what might already be an abundance around us of techno signals, and just, it takes all manners of kind of steam at the end of the day. And this is something that maybe is just jumping in too far, but like I am so affirmed now towards steam rather than just STEM as being a way forward. STEAM, adding that art into the mix, seems like so much the way that we could achieve all of our wildest, goals.
I agreed. For those who don't know, the acronym STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and we're adding the A for STEAM. And this is something I believe in as well. And I think the whole Artist-in-Residence program is kind of a big STEAM effort. So yeah, thank you for being such an integral part of it. I'm looking at some more questions. So how would you describe your genre of music, if that is possible to describe?
Record to record, it does vary. I think this one I am reaching for some new classical, but amidst, this is where it gets kind of funny and wonky. Like one of the other artists that I would quote on this record is Alice Deejay, the very important kind of cheesy trance artist from the late 90s, in the sense that not only their big song Better Off Alone, but just this kind of like smiling electronic music. Trance is one of the terms, right? But like this kind of like broadly engaging, kind of dancing, moving, affirming kind of music. And so amidst new, like we want to say any kind of new classical music where it can play with ambience, it can play with sonorities, it can play with sound design, and it's all part of this language that's oftentimes conducted through instruments like violin and otherwise. So there's plenty of that on the record, but then there's also this certain amount of techno-optimism that's played with, played against, and just, it is one of the languages by which we have looked at outer space through. The idea of like very fast-moving hyperspace. Trance is such a thing, especially for people in my generation. We've been fed this for our entire lives, that space sounds like this. And so I wanted to have moments that played a little bit with that notion or play against that notion to a degree, not just leave it in the kind of abstract shapes of jazz or classical music. So often I am encouraged by electronic music, in part because it has no bound frequencies. It doesn't exist in a single instrument or a series of instruments. It can kind of be the full depth of human hearing and therefore emotion. So I find that affirming in general, and that's kind of where my genre rests, but it moves around quite a bit. And especially if there is the opportunity to have people moving, that I also find to be intoxicating. So yeah, there's a few moments of that on the record. There's a few moments of either lurching head nod or kind of fast dancing. But
yeah, I mean, it's amazing that you weave so many components together, and I really love that about your sound. And we are a little bit over, but I'm just gonna claim this time, because there's a cool question, and I'm just gonna throw one more at you. So if that's time, I would like to know if Daedalus feels like theirs is more an audio exploration of the extraterrestrial or the extra-dimensional, or a little bit of both, perhaps.
After spending time with Steam, with SETI, excuse me, in Steam with SETI, I don't want to rule out the possibility, the very profound possibility, that extra-dimensional is as extraterrestrial. They are all, we tend to listen with our senses, and our sensory apparatus is very flat, right? Like, if there were to be extra dimensions of even listening or perception, we would have so many more avenues by which we could figure out the alien and the other. But also, from a very selfish point of view, what an incredible, profound opportunity for the arts to think in that added dimension or dimensions. You know, this whole idea that we are basically listening and existing in a two-dimensional art space where there is third, fourth, fifth dimensions that are awaiting us. I can't help but want for that. I can't help but want to live in a world that is affirmed in our own humanity because there is elsewise and other, but equally that our arts can have more resonance across more dimensions. So I don't know if that exactly answered the question, but gosh, I love that possibility of extra dimensionality. And indeed, like, if we're not looking or thinking in that way, we may be missing whole realms of possibility. So.
Agreed. I love how art can get us to these sort of large, multidimensional questions, and even ponder those kind of things. And that it would be wonderful to ponder that question listening to your music, and maybe that'll inspire some extra ideas. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and for your great question. I'm sorry that we didn't have a chance to get to everybody. I could easily talk to you for an entire hour and more. But for those who would like to see more Daedalus, make sure you see their first SETI Live. There's the link in the comments there as well. And check out the album for sure. And here's hoping for the vinyl. Thank you for a wonderful conversation, and take care. Bye.
Thank you so much, Bettina. Thank you all.